Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we are taking a look at this review copy I was sent of Art and Arcana, a visual history of Dungeons & Dragons. This book is a bit of a publishing event in the D&D world. It's the first book that I know of that takes a look at the art of Dungeons & Dragons over the course of its 40 plus years of being published. The art of D&D is incredibly influential. A lot of the monster designs and the concepts that you find in the art were used across video games, pop culture, all over the place. Enormously influential stuff, and a lot of really beautiful and really interesting works that have been dug up by the authors. The authors are Michael Whitner, Kyle Newman, John Peterson, and Sam Whitner. Now you may recognize John Peterson. He is the author of Playing at the World, which is the best book on the history of the origin of role-playing games. I actually did an interview with John a little while back. You can check that out right up here. It is the best book on the subject. So if you're interested in the history of D&D, John's book is the book to read. So it's great to see that he worked on this because that lends it an enormous amount of credentials, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the history of D&D. He has a great blog as well called Playing at the World that everyone should check out. Anyway, let's look at the back cover here. This is a hardbound book. There's also a deluxe version of this that comes in a slipcase and has a lot of extras, including maps and handouts. That looks really, really cool. Links will be down in the description below for where you can get these for yourself. Excellent construction on the book. It's definitely designed to be a coffee table book. It's very sturdy, designed to stand up to a lot of abuse. And I was very happy to see it has stitched binding. So the construction and the binding on this book is better than what we see in the 5th edition manuals, which is a little odd. It'd be nice to see those D&D books have this level of construction, but it's great to see that a D&D book has been put together with this much care. What's really wonderful about the entire book is the way that a lot of the artwork from the covers of D&D books is shown in its full glory, often for the first time, without a lot of the words and text written over it. I love this advertisement. Who needs to hang around? I've got Dungeons & Dragons. It goes all the way from the very earliest days of D&D, all the way up through the modern days of 5th edition and Critical Role. First section is Detect Magic. So it's great that there is a lot of detail put into the original edition of the game, because the art from that is extremely distinctive. Most of it was created by teenagers or just friends of Gary, who would quickly whip up drawings whenever he needed them. We have a lot of great behind-the-scenes pictures of the origins of the wargaming hobby. We can see, I don't know how the authors dug up this stuff, but there's so much great research here into looking at original sketches and the development of each of these pictures, many of which were copied off of other books that they had. They weren't proud about it, or they weren't picky. All they did is they would find a great picture, and it was very common for these war gamers who were creating these fanzines that they would pass around to one another to illustrate their stuff using art from other productions that they would trace over and alter and tweak a bit to fit what they wanted. It goes right along with the whole hacking culture that we see in the OSR today. That's really great right there. It's a cover of the very first draft of Dungeons & Dragons. Some of the very earliest sketches of different monsters. An early dragon. And I love stuff like this, so you can see where these pictures came from, right? This is the cover of the original D&D box, and you can see the cover of, or the panel from Strange Tales that it was taken from. Marvel Comics were a great source of inspiration for a lot of these artworks. So this guy, that's Nick Fury, apparently. We have a lot of walkthroughs of different types of monsters, showing their development over the course of the many editions, so you can see how they were conceptualized over time. One of the very first dungeons ever designed. We have some sections on famous dungeons. I especially like the art here from Tomb of Horrors. And whether you love or hate the Tomb of Horrors, one of the best things about it is it has these little cards with pictures of things the players see. So the players who enter a certain hallway, you can say, you see this, and you give them this picture, and they see exactly what's going on. I think that's really great because it's all done from a first-person perspective most of the time. And that's really rare in D&D illustration. I wish there was more of that. The Beholder. I kind of like this edition, or this version best. It's like chunkier, you know? So as TSR went on and the company grew as D&D expanded very quickly, they realized that they had to become much more professional. So they quickly started hiring people who were actual professional artists rather than just teenagers. There was a bit of a changing of the guard as time went on. Some of the early covers that caused a lot of concern in the 80s during the Satanic Panic and a lot of the hysteria surrounding D&D. The faces of the Demogorgon, and so on. Of course, a lot of the best art was taken from the dragon. I remember talking to Tim Kask about this and how in Dragon Magazine, he was in charge of the dragon for a long time. And there was just a giant slush pile of crazy art that people would send in. And he could go through and just pick the stuff that he liked. So there's a lot of covers that wasn't directly related to D&D at all. Like this one of a fighter pilot attacking a dragon. You could just find cool fantasy art there, even if it wasn't directly D&D related. One of my favorite things is all of these little ads here and there, because D&D used to advertise in magazines and newspapers, something you just don't see today anymore. Now it's almost completely through word of mouth. But it's interesting to see early on in its history how it tried to explain and pitch itself to people who had never heard of it. Let's move on a little bit, all the way up to first edition, where things got a little bit more professional. Here is our classic cover of the Player's Handbook for AD&D. I was actually looking for this picture for quite a long time. And as far as I know, this is the only place where you can find a high-resolution picture of the original painting without any of the text on it. You can just appreciate the artwork for what it is. And it does such a great job of selling exactly what the game is about. Not only is this picture extremely iconic, but you see what you're going to be doing. There's a little lizard here who's been sacrificed. You're going to be mapping things out. You're cleaning your sword. Over here, you're dragging a dead body through this giant doorway. And these guys up here are, of course, stealing the eyes. It sells you very clearly on what D&D is all about, at least back in AD&D. A full page of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And we have a piece on Errol Otis. Errol Otis is a huge fan favorite throughout the OSR. He's been hired to do a lot of more modern OSR books as well, so he's still around, still illustrating. He was the one who pushed a lot more of the weird and surreal illustrations. I love this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures in the book. I liked it so much that I actually made it my phone background. I love the expression on this guy's face. Like, what are you doing? Why are you worshiping me? I was just trying to cross over to the next dimension and you yanked me out and now you're bowing down before me. I just love it. It's like there's a whole little story going on here. I love the very clean design. I love the sepia colors and these sort of soft greens that he uses. It has such a distinct personality. I think that's something that's a little bit missing from more modern versions of D&D. While the artwork is by far more polished and more clean, it does seem to lack a lot of those distinct personalities that you saw in a lot of early D&D, where you could see a piece of art and you knew who drew it because the artist had very, individualistic visions of what D&D looked like. Let's move ahead to one of the more famous ones, which is the stuff from Dragonlance. See if I can find it here. Ooh, here's one of the Fiend Folio. So Dragonlance, of course, has a extremely high fantasy look to it. There we go. It's a world of, heroism, high adventure, lots of magic, dragons everywhere. It was the first setting that TSR put out that really sold you on the dragons. Because, of course, it's called Dungeons and Dragons, but a lot of players would never see a dragon or see them only very rarely. Dragonlance puts them everywhere. One of the first really big pieces of, world building, as in a whole world that is conceptually unified and complete. Most of the early D&D settings, like Blackmoor and Greyhawk, were created as they went. As the campaign expanded in one direction or another, they would get fleshed out more and more. But Dragonlance was a complete world. TSR quickly realized that, especially with AD&D and AD&D 2nd edition, that it could be quite more profitable than selling just of these textbooks of just the rules. It might be more profitable to create settings. So you had a base system, and then you had a whole bunch of different settings that you could choose from. Of course, over time, they did run into problems with this, as the setting glut made D&D more and more fractured. We have just lots of really gorgeous fantasy illustration here. Unearthed Arcana. And we have some revised editions. So, for example, this is the cover of Legends and Lore, which is the reprint of deities and demigods. They were trying to avoid the whole satanic panic concerns there by just retheming it, making it more mythological and less about gods and demons specifically. The Temple of Elemental Evil. That's a great picture from the Manual of the Planes. Let's move ahead a little bit. So we're getting into 2nd edition D&D, when they took all of the rules that Gary had originally written and they were finally rewritten and streamlined into a more digestible package. One of the interesting features here from the commentary on how the rules were developed points out that even as early as 2nd edition AD&D, they were considering switching to ascending armor class. They knew that the descending thing was confusing for a lot of players, and they wanted to make things more unified, but they were ultimately frightened of the reaction. How would players handle this? Would they be able to switch over to a new system? Would it make it not D&D anymore? And so ultimately, they stuck with descending armor class, but unified things under a THACO system that made the calculations much easier, instead of using a table that you had to look things up on. So it's interesting to see how the rules of D&D may have taken a turn in a different direction. We have Brahm and the Art of Dark Sun, one of the big fan favorite settings. I know a lot of people are really advocating for 5th edition to put out a Dark Sun setting, which was also put out in 4th edition as well. But it doesn't seem like Wizards of the Coast is as interested in opening up other settings. So far, as far as I know, everything they've done is set in the Forgotten Realms. I know they did Curse of Strahd, which originally was like in a demi-plane, but it seems like it's more in the Forgotten Realms now. I would like to see more detailed stuff for these worlds, though, for 5th edition. Although, of course, you can take the original books for these. You have to dig them up a little bit. You have to look up on eBay a bit to find them. And, of course, you can't really use the stats exactly. You have to do some translating. But probably a lot of the material is quite usable as is. So one of the great D&D artists for Planescape, Tony Terlizzi. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. His stuff is so distinct. As soon as you see a piece of art, you know that it's Tony. And it's a great way. Like I said before, they would take a setting and they would have an artist who really got to own that setting and make it their own. Whereas now they have more of a house style. So you can tell in the more recent 5th edition books when they're hiring artists, they're probably giving them a whole bunch of samples and saying, here's the general look that we're going for. And everyone moves towards that look. It makes things a bit more homogenized, unfortunately. Skipping ahead a bit, let's move on to 4th edition. Well, we have 3rd edition here. I love the covers of the 3rd edition books. I know that some people aren't as big of fans of them, but I love the in-world look. It looks like this crazy, piece of as an in-world artifact almost that you want to crack open and see what's inside. Maybe that's just because this is the first edition that I would see on bookshelves as a kid, and it really hooked me. I really loved those. I feel like the more recent ones for 5th edition aren't as strong visually and design-wise as they were back then. The art, as this book points out, of the characters in 3rd edition moved towards a more grimy, more practical dungeon punk, if you will, aesthetic. Whereas earlier it was very much knights in shining armor, and this toned things down a little bit. Now, by the time you got over to 4th edition, things ramped up higher and higher. 3.5, let's move on to 4th here. Things became more giant pauldrons, armor covered in spikes. All of the scenes that they would portray were over the top, magic blasting everywhere, people doing backflips and chopping each other in the face. It sold you on the, let's see if we can find a really good one here, the action-packed style that 4th edition offered. So that made sense because the 4th edition was so focused on combat mechanics. Yeah, there's a perfect example right there. The illustrations are about that. They're about the crazy, epic fights that you're going to get into, the amazing powers that you're going to use, the over-the-top giant enemies you're going to fight. This is a great illustration, by the way, of a fantasy city. I love that it's a lot more low-key, and it sells you on the place more than the action. I would like to see more world-building pictures similar to this one. This is great here. There's actually a little shout out to the OSR in this section. Because by the time we were into 4th edition, the backlash against 4th edition had really begun in earnest, and a lot of the people who used to play D&D in the old style or using earlier editions were all discovering each other online and starting to form communities. By the time we get to 5th edition, we have these very detailed, again, in that house style that Wizards has developed, portraying a fantasy world in a great amount of detail and with a lot more modern sensibilities. We see a lot of the beautiful map artwork, especially that done by Jared Blando. I know that he's done a lot of art for 5th edition. And we see a return to a much more grounded, realistic style, in as much as D&D is realistic. But you can see that the armor makes sense. They're doing things that an adventurer would do. They're picking up gold. They're checking their magic items. Perhaps they're praying, rather than just being in these giant pyrotechnic fights. This is a great illustration. Jason Thompson also did the art for Blood in the Chocolate. He's done a whole bunch of these where he takes famous D&D dungeons and then maps out his party's exploration of it and what happened to them. There's a lot of these. You can find these online all over the place. So, skipping forward to the end here, this is a great illustration where you can see how each of the different covers developed over time. You can watch the sensibilities of, what does D&D art look like evolve. All in all, this is a fantastic book. I've barely skimmed the surface of the amount of information. Not only are the illustrations fantastic, but the details on the historical background of where they came from and how they developed and how the readership at the time reacted to them is just top-notch stuff. Great scholarship, tons of fantastic information. This is one of my favorite books in terms of just having it out there for visitors to see. Right? You just put it out there on your coffee table, and they know what you're into. And they're going to start flipping through it and just be drawn in by the excellent artwork and into this world that has been built up over the last 40 plus years. So that's my review of Art and Arcana. I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful book. Links are going to be down in the description below. You can either get it in this edition or in the deluxe edition, as I mentioned. And join me next week when I will be reviewing Mothership. So this is coming up next. It's this little sci-fi horror book, but it has a fantastic dedication to information design, more so than I think I've seen in any RPG book. Everything is designed very clearly. There are flow charts, there are maps, there are the whole character sheet at the back is designed so that it's like a flow chart. You just go through it and you fill it out. There's so many great little design quirks in here. I'm so excited to look through this. And a big shout out especially should go to my Patreon supporters who've been doing such an amazing job keeping this whole channel going. Thanks so much, guys. As usual, you're amazing. That's it for my review today. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you guys next time.